Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Newberry Library. My name is Sarah Alvarez. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs. To all of you here in the room and those who are tuning in on the live stream, thank you for joining us for today's program, Side Impresarios, a lecture and recital. Our appreciation also must go to the Paul M. Angel Foundation for its generous support of this evening's event. Before we get started, I need to ask that everyone please silence your phones and devices at this time. Even after all these years, when you ask that, people still have to do it. So it's a necessary request, but we appreciate it. Thank you. Our mission here at the Newberry is to connect you with our extensive collection and the humanities. To do this, we organize free public programs, adult education courses, and free exhibitions based on our collection. If you'd like to explore our collection further, getting a free reader's card at our Welcome Center is a quick and easy process. Our staff are happy to answer your questions about the Newberry after the program, or you can visit our website to explore all we have to offer. Our exhibition gallery will be open after the program, so please feel free to stop in before you leave. Our current exhibition is Native Pop. Programs like this one are free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. To support our work, please consider making a gift to the Newberry. After this evening's discussion, Samantha will be in the lobby signing copies of her book, Side Impresarios, which is available for purchase in the Newberry Bookshop, which is in our lobby. We will conclude this event with a Q&A. Whether you are here in the room or online, please text your questions to 833-899-3399 at any time during the conversation. The phone number will be on the screen throughout. And now, here we go. This is the right slide. Next. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Samantha Ege. Samantha Ege is a leading scholar and interpreter of the African-American composer Florence B. Price. Her work illuminates Price in the context of the Black Chicago Renaissance and Black women's dynamic networks of advocacy, empowerment, and uplift therein. In 2019, she held a Newberry short-term resident fellowship, conducting research that contributed to her new book. As a concert pianist with 4 critically acclaimed albums to date, she has performed across the United Kingdom, Europe, North America, and Southeast Asia. Please help me in welcoming Samantha.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you. My name is Dr. Samantha Ege, and it's such an honor and a privilege to be here in Chicago sharing this work with you all. So my book is called Side Impresarios, How Race Women Transformed Chicago's Classical Music Scene. So many of you might be wondering, what is a race woman? Yes. So I use this term. It's an historical term that isn't used today, but I use this term because it captured a particular cohort of Black women who were born in the 19th century, and they were born into relative privilege and wealth. They were highly educated, and classical music was their passion. And so using this term race woman or race man acknowledges that we're talking about a specific group within the African American community. These women were quite different to the majority of Black women of their time who did not enjoy such privileges that these women enjoyed. Also, as you can see, many of them had a lighter skin complexion. Some of them were white passing and racially ambiguous. And so that enabled them a sort of mobility within society. But to be a race woman was to recognize those privileges and to recognize one's duty, and to use one's privilege and power to uplift the masses. So that's how I define race women in this book. So you're probably wondering how a Black British woman came to write this story. In 2009, I was an exchange student at McGill University in Canada. I was 19 years old, studying music, and I'd been playing the piano since I was about 3 years old. But I had never heard of any Black women in classical music until my professor, had a course on early 20th century music. I didn't really know anything about early 20th century music. So when I saw the name Florence Price, who's pictured on the left here, she was as unknown to me as all of the other names on the syllabus. But I read her story, I listened to her music, and I was blown away by the fact that a Black woman was writing symphonically, was writing classical music. Should I carry on? And so learning about Florence Price was incredibly transformative. So hands up if you know who Florence Price is by now. Okay, a few of you. Okay. So Florence Price was the first Black woman to have a symphony performed by a major national orchestra. Who knows what that orchestra was? The Chicago Symphony, yes. So that was June 15, 1933. She wrote a symphony number 1 in E minor that this orchestra performed. Their track record hasn't been the best since, but it was a historic moment in terms of not just uplifting a Black woman's voice, but really uplifting Black classical Chicago. And I'll get into that later, but that's really what the book is about. But for me, having played the piano for most of my life, learning that there was a Black woman in classical music was really eye-opening. What I loved about Florence Price's music is the way that she had this classical sound that was very familiar to me because of my training as a classical pianist. But there was something else, the way that she went into her heritage, not via the blues, not via jazz, but via the music of the enslaved. She used Negro spirituals in the same way that Brahms used Hungarian dances. It was incredibly powerful to see a Black woman uplifting her heritage in that way. The other composer that I heard about was Margaret Bonds, pictured to the right here. So Florence Price was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and Margaret Bonds was born in Chicago. And she is of a later generation, and she was a student of Florence Price and a friend of Florence Price as well. And so to learn about these two women in the same city who were such close friends, writing classical music was just such an incredible moment in terms of my trajectory. And I knew that from that moment, I had to find a way to make these two women the center of my universe. So fast forward to 2019, and I get a Newberry Library short-term fellowship. And this was me celebrating on Facebook to the left here. My project was a comparative study of two women, Florence Price on the left and Theodora Stackhouse-Ryder on the right, whose archives are here at the Newberry. Florence Price was a woman of mixed ancestries, including African ancestry. Theodora Stackhouse-Ryder was a woman of European immigrant background. And so this study was about looking at what were the experiences of two women composing in Chicago, but also living slightly different lives across the color line. While I was here in Chicago, and at the Newberry specifically, I also came across this document to the right here, which is a program for a ballet by Catherine Dunham, who was based in Chicago for a time. And when you look at this back page here that says patronage, you can see a lot of the Side Impresarios who are in my book. And so the woman at the top is Helen Abbott, who was the first wife, I should say, of Robert Abbott, who founded the Chicago Defender. He moved on with a younger wife, and she moved on with a lucrative divorce settlement. And that enabled her to continue to sponsor the arts. And so one of the things that I talk about in this book is how strategically these women married. They married judges and lawyers, people who could help support their interests. If we go further down this list, we have Mr. and Mrs. Albert B. George. Now, the Mrs. in that list is Maude Roberts George, and she was the woman who actually entered a contract with the Chicago Symphony to ensure that Florence Price's music would be performed. And so that's a story that isn't really widely known. So many people will know about Florence Price, and if they know about her, they'll know that she had that debut with the Chicago Symphony. But they wouldn't necessarily know that it was a Black woman who underwrote the contract in order for that to happen. And in this program as well, Margaret Bonds was performing. So it's a really wonderful representation of the sisterhood. So this aspect of my research fed into a chapter called The Black Classical Metropolis, which is chapter 3 of my book. So to the left, we've got Catherine Dunham here. I think you can see her in a very striking pose, in the same way that these women in the world of music were taking African-American folk songs and mixing it with the European tradition. Catherine Dunham did the same with ballet. So she would study the dances of the Caribbean, of Africa, of the diaspora, and infuse that into traditional ballet. In the middle, this is Maude Roberts George, pictured to the left with the flowers, and to the right of her is Estella Bonds, the mother of Margaret Bonds. And Estella was a real community builder in terms of Black classical Chicago. They called her home the Bonds Salon. If you were anyone in the world of Black classical music, then you knew this address, because this was the place where the most esteemed Black classical performers could meet with those just starting out in their career. It was a real hub for intergenerational exchange. As part of this research, it was also really fascinating to learn about Marjorie Stewart Joyner, who was the president of the Madam C.J. Walker Company, had her branch here in Chicago. You can see her doing a hairstyling session for budding students. What's really interesting, though, is that Marjorie Stewart Joyner ran for the mayor of Bronzeville, and Maude Roberts George and all of Black classical Chicago really got behind her. Unfortunately, she wasn't successful in her campaign, but it's really interesting to think about how these women weren't just active in the worlds of dance and music, but in politics too. So these areas that might be seen as rather frivolous, ballet, classical music, styling hair and beauty, also had a really striking political edge to them as well. So if anyone has spent time with the Newberry, then you would know that the Newberry's got an amazing map collection. And that alerted me to these maps, which are in the digital collections of the University of Chicago. But during my time here as a fellow, I really enjoyed getting to know a little bit more about this geography and thinking not just about these women musically, but thinking about them in terms of space. Seeing these maps from the 1930s and 40s really affirmed to me as an outsider just how man-made this segregated geography is. It gave me a really strong understanding of how these women were able to work with such energy and self-sufficiency. Their geography demanded that of them. And so that led me to commission maps for my book. So anytime you come across an address in my book, you can come to my first interlude here. This is the South Side map, and you've got the home addresses, you've got churches, you've got the clubhouses, basically anywhere where these women, used place as a way to establish themselves, establish their communities. You can see that in the book here. And so I took the language from a guidebook for those visiting Chicago, and I repurposed it in terms of the Race Women's Guide to the Realm of Music. And so changing the gender, I wrote, "This little book does not pretend to be complete, but the information here gathered will prove invaluable alike to the stranger seeking a convenient guide, to the citizen desiring to post herself, and to the business and professional woman wishing to read a reference book of worthwhile Negroes in Chicago." So my book begins with the moment that Florence Price makes her symphonic debut. The context is the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. So I'd like to just read a little bit of that for you now. "A new day has dawned for women. A new deal is here. Action has taken place quickly, and women have come into their own. It is fitting at this time that the Negro woman should take her part in the century of progress and prove to the world that she too is finding her place in the sun." And that's Elizabeth Lindsay Davis in her foreword to a monumental volume called Lifting as They Climb. The book begins. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra premiered Florence Beatrice Price's Symphony No. 1 in E minor on June 15, 1933, at the Chicago World's Fair Century of Progress Exposition. With this performance, Price became the first woman of African descent to make her symphonic debut with a major U.S. orchestra. In turn, the all-white, all-male Chicago Symphony became the first institution of its kind and caliber to bring the work of a Black female composer into its repertoire. Held under the auspices of the Chicago Friends of Music, the Negro in Music program, to which Price's premiere belonged, unfolded beneath the proscenium arch that yawned across the orchestra pit of the Chicago Symphony and faced the glittering diamond horseshoe where patrons from both Black and white society could be found. The concert formed one of the many musical parts behind Chicago's World Fair, of which the theme was a linearly construed depiction of Chicago's progress from 1833 to 1933. Belying this narrative, though, was an amalgamation of intersecting and even conflicting agendas housed in the fair, all of which fed into the Negro in music. From historic firsts for the race on stage, through white box holders' loud displays of power and popularity, to quiet acts of Black women's patronage behind the scenes, what happened in the Auditorium Theatre on June 15 was, really, a matter of perspective. And so with this book, I journey around the different perspectives, because not only did you have race women present here, but you also had, I guess, the cream of Chicago society, with John Alden Carpenter, a very famous composer during that time, and also George Gershwin. So he was present as this program unfolded. So you can see Florence Price's Symphony in E minor in the middle. Here it says first performance. And then after the intermission, you've got the concertina for piano and orchestra by John Alden Carpenter, with Miss Margaret Bonds as the soloist. So not only do we have with Florence Price the first Black woman to have a symphony performed by a major national orchestra, but with Margaret Bonds, we also have the first Black woman instrumentalist to play, actually the first ever Black instrumentalist to play with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I should also mention that the program begins with the music of John Powell, a very contentious figure. He was an avowed white supremacist. He believed that, in his words, the Negro had no future in the United States, which is odd because he wrote a lot of music based on spirituals, so he seemed like a very conflicted soul. He was actually one of the most programmed US composers during the 1920s and 30s. And so when we look at this program, we can see where the Side Impresarios wanted to represent Black classical achievement, but we can also see a sense of compromise where perhaps the Chicago Symphony or other entities would have put forward a name like Powell, who would have been more mainstream, unfortunately. But it also makes me very proud to see my fellow countryman Samuel Coleridge Taylor up there, another Black Brit who felt very, very much connected to Black classical music making across the pond. And so with my book, I ask, what narratives emerge when we retell progress along the race woman's timeline and look for the ways in which she, like her white counterparts, took her place in the century of progress rather than waiting for it to be given? So this is a story of the behind-the-scenes work that makes a classical composer. This is a story of sisterhood. It's a story of love, and it's a story that I'm incredibly proud to tell. So I would like to move on to some music now, beginning with Florence Price's Sonata in E minor. So she wrote this piece at the same time that she was working on the symphony, and you can hear in her piano writing a real sense of drama. She's writing very orchestrally. So it's always special to play Florence Price's music, but really special to play it here in Chicago. So I didn't play the scherzo from this movement because we would end up going over time, but if you would like to hear the full sonata, I did record it on my first album, which is called For Women. You probably guessed the Nina Simone tribute there. And also there are recordings of me playing the full sonata, including at the Chicago Cultural Center back in 2019. So when I was writing Side Impresarios, there were a range of resources that I drew from in order to animate these women's lives. And one of them was a letter written by Margaret Bonds. The essay was called A Reminiscence from 1967. And in that essay, she talks about what her upbringing was like. I think of her as a daughter of the Black Chicago Renaissance because she really absorbed so much of this world. At one point, Florence Price was going through a lot of personal difficulty. She was going through a divorce. At one point, her husband had threatened her at gunpoint. She had 2 young children. You've also got the context of the Great Depression as well, because this was around the early 1930s. And so Florence Price went to live with the Bonds family. She took her 2 young children, and she became part of the Bonds family household. And so when I'm reading this essay that Margaret Bonds wrote in 1967, what really comes across is how serious this time was for Florence Price. Because not only do you have all of these things going on, but there's also a major deadline for a contest called the Rodman Wanamaker Music Contest. And this was for Black composers of classical music, because relatively speaking, there were lots of opportunities for Black composers of pop or jazz, other sort of more popular forms that could reach the wider masses. Black classical musicians were definitely a rather niche market. And so this contest was a really important platform that really galvanized Black classical musicians and gave them, the impetus to invest in their craft. And so there was a deadline coming up, and Florence Price was working really hard to meet that deadline. And so I'm sure we can all relate to the stress of a deadline. So she's got all of the personal woes, and on top of that, this big composition deadline. Well, it's good news because she won, and she won with the symphony that was performed by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So it was obviously very worthwhile. But as I was, again, spending more time with the archives, I came across a recorded version of the story spoken by Margaret Bonds, pictured here. This is her in later life. Actually, this picture is from the Center for Black Music Research, also here in Chicago. And so this interview that Margaret Bonds gives in 1971, she's talking about the story that I read in her A Reminiscence essay. And what really comes across, though, through her storytelling is the fun of this time, the fun of working with Florence Price, the fun of this sisterhood, how much she enjoyed the chaos in a way. You can hear that she loves to laugh, and there are times when she just bursts out into ripples of laughter, telling the story of how Florence Price spent time in her family home. Unfortunately, Margaret Bonds passed away only about 4 months after this recording was made. And so it really reflects how cherished it is to be able to hear her voice, because I haven't heard the voice of Florence Price. I haven't heard the voice of many of the women in this book. So it's really, again, I'm very aware of space. So just being able to bring Margaret Bonds' voice back into this space is very special. So this is the voice of Margaret Bonds.
Then that other composer, Florence B. Price, did you ever hear of her? She has one very, very famous spiritual arrangement called My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord. Haven't you heard that? You must have. Leontine sings it.
Yeah, maybe that's where it is.
My soul's been anchored in the Lord. You see, if a composer gets one thing that makes a hit, you're happy about it. And Mother took her into our house. She'd had trouble with her. She had 2 children, and she had trouble with the second marriage. She was very, very down and out. And Mother moved her into our house, and we had in Chicago a tremendous kitchen. And the weather in Chicago was so cold that we didn't have the kind of heating then that we have now. And Florence and I would sit in that kitchen, and I was trying to help her with her extractions of orchestration parts and whatnot, you know. And then sometimes when she would get pushed, almost every black musician in Chicago would be farmed out to help Florence get her work out. I'm not kidding you. She would, she seemed to procrastinate.
Sorry, she knew she'd get help.
When Florence had something that she had to do, every musician in Chicago, black, who could write, was either scratching mistakes or copying or extracting or doing something to get Florence's work done. Isn't that the craziest thing?
So who can relate to that story of being a procrastinator? I definitely can. So it was really wonderful to hear the story come to life and to hear the laughter. And that's what I've really tried to convey in my book, the fact that this is not just a story of women struggling. It's a story of women finding ways to thrive and to enjoy what they do and to make space. So writing this book, as if that wasn't enough, made me think about how I could be an impresario in my own work, because I am also a pianist. I would always say I'm a historian first, but I do play the piano. And so I had a piece commissioned based on my book by the composer Camilla Cortina Bello. We met quite a few years ago while we were both living in Singapore, which is somewhat of a longish story, but at some point we were both in Singapore, and she was teaching and also playing in jazz clubs. And I was teaching elementary and middle school music. At this stage, I wasn't really on that musicology and definitely not on the performance path. But I kept feeling Florence Price calling, and I knew that eventually I had to get onto that path. And so later down the line, 2019, I was presenting my relatively new research on Florence Price at Berkeley. I didn't realize that Camilla was also there. I was heading to the conference, took a wrong turn, and I ran into Camilla. And we connected, and I think because we were both really pursuing more of what felt like our calling. Camilla was studying under Terry Lynn Carrington, the Grammy Award-winning drummer, and I had started my work on Florence Price and obviously had this experience of the fellowship. There was more of a sisterhood that sort of came about between us. So I asked Camilla further down the line if she would write a piece based on my book, which she hadn't read yet, but she said yes. And I'm very glad that she said yes, because the piece that I'm going to play for you next is Camilla's piece. And so realizing that she said yes, I decided to get a bit picky, and I asked her if she would write for me a Florence Price theme. So the theme is from Fantasy Negre in E minor by Florence Price. And so when I was telling you the story of my experience at McGill, this was the first piece that I ever heard by a black woman, and this was Florence Price's piece. And if you look underneath the title, it says, "To my talented little friend, Margaret A. Bonds," who was 15 years old. And this piece is so hard. So it gives you an idea of just how talented she was as a pianist. This fantasy is based on the spiritual sinner, "Please don't let this harvest pass." So I'm just going to play for you a little bit of Fantasy Negre. And I also asked Camilla for a Margaret Bonds theme. And this was the second piece that I ever heard by a black woman composer. And so this piece is called Troubled Water and is based on the spiritual wade in the water. And so I'm going to play a little bit of Margaret Bonds' Troubled Water for you now. That one's also on my album. In fact, all of these pieces are on my album, so you can continue to listen to the rest of them. I also wanted Camilla to just bring her full self to the piece that she wrote for me, which is called Bravura. I chose the title Bravura because I loved its energetic and very assertive description, but also its feminine ending, which I think really captures what this book is all about. And so Camilla works with the Florence Price theme, she works with the Margaret Bonds theme, but she also brings in a lot of her own Cuban influences, which is really wonderful to hear. I can't remember if I mentioned that she was Cuban, but now you know.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to Samantha. Again, you can check out our bookshop. The exhibition is open tonight. Feel free to check it out while you're here. Your generosity is what keeps us going. Please consider a donation tonight. And our next program will be the Boston Massacre, A Family History. It will be a book talk on April 26th. Thank you so much. Have a good night.